Welcome to this presentation on the Constitutional Convention. We're going to look at the 1787 convention that occurred to at first amend the Articles of Confederation and then to ultimately replace them. We're going to look at, remember that the reason for it would be the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, as we have discussed previously. And then there's going to be two issues that kind of in between 1781 and 87 that certainly push us down the road a little bit of changing constitutions, and that's Shays' Rebellion and economic issues that existed at that time. And then also there are within the Constitution itself, we want to look at three compromises that were critical at the convention that allowed us to actually get this document done. So, leading up to the Constitutional Convention, there was this event in 1786 known as Shays' Rebellion. It was a rebellion of Massachusetts farmers against the state government of Massachusetts. And what happened was that this rebellion ultimately created a lot of fear that the national government was simply not strong enough to deal effectively with widespread rebellion. And as we saw in our presentation on the Articles of Confederation, it wasn't. It simply wasn't. It didn't have an enforcement branch. It didn't have an interpretation branch. It could only make laws, and it was extremely limited in the laws that it could make. And so the states were on their own when it came to controlling the people of their state, and the national government was not of much aid. So in 1786, this particular occurrence raised a lot of concern about that question. Was the national government strong enough to help states to deal with any sort of significant or widespread rebellion? The other really big issue of this time was a series of economic issues. With little or no power to raise revenue, the national government struggled to repay its domestic and foreign debt. The national government had uh, created debt from the years under the Articles of Confederation and previously, and as a result of that, because it couldn't demand revenue, couldn't tax, it couldn't repay its domestic and foreign debt, and so that was a problem here. In America, it was also a problem in our relationship with foreign countries, and it certainly caused us to sort of delegitimize the government of the United States in the eyes of foreign countries. The national government lacked the power to create and enforce uniform trade regulations. This is the second problem, both inside America and between America and other countries. So um, we could not create a uniform system of moving goods from one state to another, and that was a problem. And also, we could not really maintain any kind of authority over the trade between the United States and other countries. Another real problem under the Articles of Confederation. So, for these reasons, economically, there was concerns that our economic stability was in jeopardy. And so this kind of pushed us down the road. Shays' Rebellion and these economic issues compelled the states in 1787 to send representatives to a constitutional convention whose purpose was to amend the Articles of Confederation to create a more effective national government. Now, notice that purpose was not to replace the Articles, it was to amend the Articles. That's going to change once they get there. But the initial purpose of the Constitutional Convention was to amend the Articles to deal with these issues, issues involving rebellion, issues involving debt, and issues involving trade. So there are three compromises that occurred in the convention that are critical because if these are the areas in which if the delegates could not come together, there would be no constitution. Now, as I said before, they originally started to work on the articles to see if they could amend them. That didn't take very long because quickly people realized that the document itself was impossible to amend and unworkable. And so they did begin shortly after coming together in 1787 to write a new constitution. And the three compromises that occurred there, the first of which was what we call the Representation Compromise, the Great Compromise. This was a really big issue about how do we represent the states, how do we represent the people of this country in Congress, in a legislative branch. And so the compromise they came up with was a bicameral legislature. Remember, under the Articles, there was a unicameral legislature, one one body within the legislature, and each state had one vote. So in this Constitution, in the 1787 Constitution, there's a bicameral legislature. There's two parts, two bodies within the legislative branch of government. There's an upper house, the United States Senate, in which every state had equal representation. Every state had two representatives in the Senate. In the lower house, the House of Representatives, each state got votes, representation based on the number of people, or what we call proportional representation. And so this really came out of a simple question. This compromise came out of a simple question. How do we fairly represent a state like Rhode Island, which has a very small number of people, in comparison to a state like New York or Virginia, which had a lot of people? And so what they came up with was, in the upper house, the small states would be represented equally with the large states, with the same amount of representation. But in the lower house, we would take account of the fact that some states are bigger than others, so there'd be proportional representation in the lower house. So this is a compromise between those two competing factions in the convention, the small states and the large states population-wise. That's the Representation Compromise. From the Representation Compromise comes a second compromise that's known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. So once they passed the Representation Compromise, decided how they're going to represent people in the country and how they represent the states, that raised a second question, which is, in the states where there's slavery, like in the South, where a state like South Carolina might have as many slaves as free people living there, how do you count the slaves in all of this? Did the slaves count for representation in the House of Representatives? And that's the question. This has to do with the House of Representatives. It's proportional. The number of people living in your state determines how many representatives you have. So if you have a very small state in the House of Representatives, you might only have a few people, a few representatives in that body. If you have a very large state, like New York, you might have 20 representatives in that body. And it's based on how many people live there. Well, in this case of South Carolina and other southern states that had a large proportion of people that were slaves, how do you count those slaves? Do they count? Do they not count? And this is a very interesting argument that Southerners made. Southerners argued that they should count. Very hypocritical. They said they should count just like anybody else counts, that we should give full representation based on how many people live here, slave or free. And obviously, it's an incredibly hypocritical argument. In a state where slaves weren't given their freedom, they weren't given citizenship, they didn't have the right to vote. Southerners wanted them to count for representation. Northerners said that's not fair. It doesn't make sense. You don't give them the right to vote. You don't give them citizenship. They shouldn't count for representation. And so the compromise was, and look at this fraction. It's very interesting. 3/5. 3/5 of the slave population would count, essentially. Basically, they took the number of slaves that lived in a state and they multiplied it by 3/5, and that's how many counted. Basically, 60% of the slave population counted. This didn't mean that they were represented. That doesn't mean that they got to vote or be citizens. It just meant that that's how they counted for the purpose of representation. And so it's very interesting, the number and the haggling that went back and forth to get to that number really tells us a lot about our country at this time and the depth of the issue of slavery at this time. The last compromise also has to do with slavery. It's called the Slave Trade Regulation of Commerce Compromise. And so the question here was, do we want the Congress to be able to regulate commerce? And as I said before, that was one of the issues that caused us to come together to write a new Constitution in the first place. The inability of the government under the old Constitution to effectively regulate trade between the states and between the United States and other countries. And so they wanted Congress to have some power over this, but slave owners in the South were afraid that if the Congress had power over the slave trade, that they would eliminate if they had power over commerce, that they would eliminate the slave trade. And so in this compromise, the slave trade was protected from elimination for 20 years. So Southerners had a 20-year window to import slaves into the country. And in exchange for that, Congress was given the right to regulate commerce with foreign nations among the several states and with the Indian tribes. And that's in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. So compromise number 3, slave trade regulation of commerce compromise. So these compromises, very important. They tell us a lot about where the country was at the time, what the key issues were. And again, without these compromises, there's no possibility of a new constitution being written. So the overview of the Constitutional Convention, what we've looked at in this presentation, again, the convention came together in 1787. It came together because the Articles of Confederation was weak and an ineffective constitution, and because of a rebellion that caused a lot of fear, Shays' Rebellion, which caused a lot of fear in America about the government not having the power to put down widespread rebellion because of economic issues involving trade, economic issues involving debt, and other things that were becoming more and more unstable, and the government was not really able to provide solid leadership with. And then lastly, when that convention came together in 1787, those 3 critical compromises hurdles that had to be overcome so that this document could be written. So the Constitutional Convention, an absolutely fascinating moment in American history in which these important things had to be addressed in order to write our new Constitution, the one that we have today.